All right, so you guys want to come on up here? We're talking about slip. This is going to be our second surface technique that we're talking about. So last week we talked about making marks on clay. I know some of you guys missed that, but I sent a YouTube video out. Did everyone get that? Yep, did everyone watch it? It's okay if you didn't watch it, you didn't have to. Just if you want to see what we missed. We talked about how I trim for surface and glaze and making marks on pots. So tonight we're talking about slip. Slip is a way that we can get detail on a pot with a little bit more color. I've got a bunch of different techniques that I'm going to talk about. There are pros and cons to using slip. So we'll talk through all of that. All slip is clay that we can add color to get detail. We can also just use slip as a way to add texture to a piece. So when I'm looking at this right here, this is just slip. So it's just really watered down clay, all the stuff coming off on our hands when we're throwing. That technique is called combing. So in order to comb, what I would do is take just a little bit of the joining slip, or any slip that you've made when you're throwing. You can take some of that and use that to make little patterns with the clay. Just is going to add some texture to it. So we were playing around with making little flowers last time using slip. We were also playing around with making little mountains. All that black in there is an underglaze. That's called inlay. We'll talk about glaze inlay a little later. We'll talk about slip inlay today. It's just laying color into lines. But what I can do is just take some of this slip, put it on a leather hard piece. Leather hard is super important for slip. If your pot is too dry and you try and put slip on it, that really wet clay is going to start to dry. But if your piece is already completely dry, it's not going to shrink anymore. So this is going to shrink a ton. This isn't going to shrink at all, and you're going to get cracks on the surface. So that can look really cool. We're going to talk about that on this piece. But for most of the time, we want our slip to go on a leather hard piece. So as soon as I'm done trimming it, that's when I add the slip. So I'm going to take a little bit of this slip, lay it on here. We can just get a little layer going, and this is called combing. So this is not using colored slip. You could use colored slip to do this, but right now all I'm using is straight slip. And once I've got this, you can kind of just play around with texture. So if I take my finger and kind of just run it back and forth, we get some little stripes going. That can be kind of fun. We can also be a little bit more exact with it. We can play with patterns a little bit more. So I'm going to take my finger and just add some stripes in here. And what this can do is just add some fun texture to our pieces. So when we pick a glaze, if we pick a super runny glaze or work some glaze down in those cracks, it can change the surface a little bit more and make that glaze play a little bit more. If you don't like it, just start fresh. You can kind of smush it all out. Start with a blank canvas. And then I might go in, I'm going to play around with adding some little swoops to it. So getting texture that way. You can also play around with some different tools and see what those will give you when you comb. So if I get a completely flat surface and I go in with, say, I don't know, a needle tool, and just take that needle and add some little stripes in there, you can get some really cool surface that way. So you've got a lot of texture going this way, but you've also got texture coming up this way. So if you're like, I can't draw, I can't design very well, I'm not a super two-dimensional visual person, I don't like to draw kind of thing, I just want to play with patterns and texture, this is a really fun thing to do. On this one, where we made the mountains, what we can do is just start with a blank canvas, and then go in with a finger and kind of just outline a little mountain, add some texture down below, and then we get a little mountain going that way. So there's lots of different things you can play with just slip. Just adding some texture on the surface of the pot. That's called combing. So all I'm using is joining slip, just straight up joining slip. You can also just use watered down clay from your throwing bucket, anything like that. Once we get away from joining slip and we get into colored slip, those all live right up here. So these buckets there are all colored slip. We've got a tile that usually hangs out on this wall right here that shows all of the colored slips when they're fired. So this is similar to this, but it's not exactly the same. This is just clay that we're getting from our bags, slaked down with water, super runny. This is a clay that we make so that it fits for all different kinds of clay bodies. So as the clay dries, it's going to shrink. Different clays shrink at different amounts. This is made specially so that it will shrink for all kinds of clay bodies. So these are going to be a little bit smoother. They're not going to be as chunky as this stuff. And they're all the same base, so we make a white base for it, and then just add different stains to get all these different colors. Most of them are pretty consistent to how they look. So like when I pull out the black slip right here, it's a pretty dark color. It looks black. There's a couple that aren't quite how they look when they come out. So like this blue-gray slip right here, it fires this color. It's kind of a dark gray color. But when it comes out of the bucket, it's red. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you're using. The cobalt fires a nice dark blue like this, but when it comes out of the bucket, it's kind of this pale gray color. So just something to think about if you're doing, say, flowers and you wanted to make the leaves this cobalt blue, and then, I don't know, like the inside of those leaves or those petals, this mango, you might have a really dark red first, and then kind of a light pink first, and then second. But when it gets fired, it'll actually turn into this dark blue and that kind of mango color. So these live right here. This will just show you what the colors just look like afterwards. When you're ready to play with the colored slips, in the second drawer down here, there's a bunch of spoons. You'll take one of those, and you're gonna grab your bucket of slip and just mix it up. So get all of that mixed, all the heavy bits settle to the bottom, and there's a thin layer of water on the top. It's kind of like when we're glazing, but you don't have to whisk this up as often. So just give it a good whisk right at the beginning, and it should be good to go for the rest of that day. Brushes that you can use for slips are right here. So if you're going for more detailed slip application, take a little brush. There's some bigger brushes. If you want to add a ton, there's some really big brushes right in here. You got a couple different sizes of brushes down in this cabinet, or this drawer right there. Okay, so that's just the slip stuff. Now we're gonna actually start talking about technique. The first technique we'll talk about with colored slip is just painting. So whatever detail I see, I usually say this in my glaze demo, if you try and paint with glaze, you're not gonna see any of that detail. I always say, if you make a smiley face with glaze, that smiley face is gonna run and look really freaky. Slip will stay true to whatever you have. So if you draw a leaf like this, it is gonna stay that leaf. Because it is clay, it's not gonna run, it's not gonna move at all. So after I've got my slip all mixed up, I can take a paintbrush and I can just start painting with it. So if you like to paint, I don't know, smiley faces, you can paint a little smiley face right on your pot, and then whatever smiley face you see, that's the smiley face you're gonna get. If you're like, I don't like doing perfect things, or not perfect things, but like detailed things, I like patterns and just designs, you can totally draw or paint with slip that way. I'm just gonna make a couple lines like that. And I've seen some really cool stuff come out of classes where people are like, I'm scared to slip because I don't want to make these perfect things, but just play with patterns and have fun like that. You can also layer different colors. So say I went in with a white slip and then did like a checkerboard that way. That could look really cool. You can mix colors of slip, but they don't mix like true color theory. So if you add blue and yellow, you're not really gonna get a green, you're gonna get kind of a brown color. If you add white to a color, it'll lighten it up, and if you have black to a color, it'll darken it out. But these really don't mix like true color theory. So you can try it if you want to. There's some little palettes right down here. So you can try mixing colors together, like mixing a blue and a yellow and seeing if it makes a green. But it probably won't be super green. It'll probably go more brown than green. And you won't know how well it mixes until it gets completely fired. So it's a big experiment, but if you're like, I really want to try and make a green, and this sage green just really isn't hitting it for me, you want to make a brighter green, you can definitely try adding like the robin's egg and the yellow, making a little green that way, and then putting it through, like if you have a little test tile, making that green, trying it out, firing it all the way through, and then seeing if it works. That's why those test tiles are nice to be able to play around with stuff on. But try it and see. So we can paint with this. Any texture that we get with slip is texture that we're gonna get. So when I look at these eyes right here, they're a little bit raised. If I ran my finger over it, they'll probably smear right now, but later on, if I ran my finger and felt a little bit of raised texture, that raised texture is gonna stay. I can feel that on this piece. When I run my finger over, especially right here, that little tail end of that orange bit, I can feel the texture there. So that can be really fun. Like these dots have quite a bit of texture. If you have a pot that's got texture all over the whole thing, like a bunch of little dots, that can be really fun to feel, especially if it's like on a handle and you've got a little dot up on the top of the handle, that can be really fun to feel. But if it's really sharp, that sharp texture is gonna stay. So like when I feel this flower, that's pretty sharp. I wouldn't want that on something that I'm gonna hold. It'd be great on the vase because I'm not gonna be messing with that, but if this was right where your handle was and you're grabbing that, it's not gonna feel super comfortable. So any texture that you get from slip, that texture is gonna stay. So keep that in mind. All right, so we've talked about painting with slip. It just paints on whatever texture you see is what you're gonna get. We've talked about combing. We're gonna talk about inlay, inlaying with slip. So when we inlay with slip, what we do first is we carve out any patterns that we want or any designs that we want. And then once it's dried up a little bit, we're gonna paint some slip over the top of that and then scrape that slip away. So on this piece right here, I've got some markings that I made. What I would do is take my slip and a paintbrush, and I would paint over these markings. And I go kind of loose. I don't want to go all over the entire thing, but I want to fill all those lines in. Make sure that slip gets down in there. Fills it all the way up. One thing to be cautious about is the thickness and the deepness of your line. If your line's too thin, when you start scraping the clay away, you're gonna scrape through your line. So I have right here a really, really fine line there. If you guys can see that, I know it's hard to see, but I have a really fine line and then a much deeper line here, just to show you how much they'll scrape away. So I'm gonna fill those in with my slip. And then I would let it dry until the slip doesn't look shiny anymore. So right now that looks pretty dang shiny. Usually takes about 10 minutes or so, but just to speed it up, I'm gonna blast it really quick, just to show you guys. So you're gonna heat this up. Just until it doesn't look shiny anymore. Then I'm gonna go in with a metal rib tool and I'm gonna start scraping away that slip. So that as I scrape, we can see those lines start to come through. So this really deep line right here, that's showing up a lot better than this fine line, especially as I scrape more and more away to get a really clean vision of that line. We can see that deep line is staying super clean, but that really fine line is starting to work itself out.
Now you're scraping in the direction of the line or across it?
Yep, so I'm scraping with the line this way. I'm scared if I scrape this way, I'm gonna be pulling clay into that line.
Okay.
So where it gets a little bit tricky is when you have lines going different ways. So like on these diagonals, I've got them going both ways. So as I scrape, I would just scrape little bits by little bits. I might even use the rounded edge and just slowly scrape away. So like I've got these two straight lines right there. I can scrape those along with the line. When I start getting to the diagonal lines, the kind of zigzaggy lines, I'm gonna just pull a little bit at a time and just see if anything's getting smudged out. So as I start to scrape, and I'm trying to clean that slip off of my tool as I do this, so I'm not working any more of that slip into there. But as I scrape, you start seeing those zigzags come through. And those zigzags, because they're going both directions, I want to pull just a little bit so I'm not smudging over the lines. as I start to work it, it's slowly starting to pop out. If you do this when it's too wet, which this is a little bit on the wet side, it's getting really smeary. So if you let it dry a little bit longer, you'll get cleaner lines coming out. So these diagonal lines are getting a little bit trickier because I have to go all kinds of ways. So a good learning process or learning curve for this is to keep it with straight lines and go the direction of the line. Don't try and go across the line. So I guess we could do that on this one right here. As I start to come across the line this way, it starts to smear it up. And then you're not getting a super clean line. But as soon as I go with the line, it starts to clean it up. So just something to think about.
How did you do those flowers on that base then?
This one?
Yeah.
So this I did not do. This was with just a needle tool or a ball tool. I'm going to talk about using tools in a little bit, but what are these? And then my guess, knowing who did it, they meticulously went through and scraped off each little bit.
Oh wow.
So yeah, it can definitely take quite a long time. But like if I was to look at this, I have a circle right here. Can't go in any one straight way. I would just slowly kind of pick away at it and just barely scrape that top layer of slip off. So like we can see as I just slowly work around it, it's starting to come out. It's just about taking your time with it. So if you have a really meticulous design, and it's really detailed, you just have to go super slow. So that's starting to come out as I work my way along that circle. And I don't want to take up too much time, but
Can you do the same type of technique with an underglaze versus the slip?
you can. We talk about underglaze next week, so I'll go through and talk about pros and cons of underglaze versus slip. Underglaze is very similar to slip. It's just got a couple more pros. It can go on at different times than slip can. Slip can only go on leather hard. Underglaze goes on at different times, but it also can go on leather hard. But we'll get into that next week. But yes, hypothetically you could. Okay, so that's inlay. Does anyone have questions on that? Do it when the clay is stiffer. It'll work better for you. Next technique is sgraffito. I'm biased, but it's the best technique. Sgraffito is when you put, it's kind of the opposite of inlay. So with inlay, I make marks first and then put slip on top and carve away to get designs. With sgraffito, you put the slip on first and then make marks to carve through the clay. So you get kind of a positive negative effect. I put the slip on a while ago. If the slip is too wet when you try and carve it, you're gonna get boogers in it. So if I were to do sgraffito on this side of the panel right here, I'd take my slip, mix it all up, take a big brush, and I like to go in a couple different directions when I'm doing my slip. So I'll go vertical like this as one coat, and then horizontal like this for my second coat, and then vertical again for my third coat. Just to make sure it gets all those layers really evenly distributed. If you don't let this dry, so once the surface doesn't look tacky anymore, then it needs longer after that. So the biggest problem I see with people when they're doing sgraffito is they put the slip on, the surface isn't tacky anymore, and then they start carving it, but that clay underneath is still really wet. So when you carve through, you get all these little boogers on there. So I'm gonna take this little loop tool, and I'm gonna start carving through. And when I do this, I'm getting little boogers on the side right there. And then when I try and go and clean those off, it just kind of smudges, and it's not very clean. So you want to let it sit for quite a while. So I put the slip on pretty long ago. I hit it with a blowtorch. It still might be too wet. What I can do though is just give a little bit of a pull with my tool and see if any boogers are forming. So I'm getting less boogers, but I'm still getting boogers on the side. If I were to be getting those boogers, I would just leave it out in the air, let it dry for like maybe another 10 minutes or so, and then try again. That's the trickiest part, is if you do it too soon, you're gonna get those boogers and you're not gonna get very clean lines. Tools that you can use for Sgraffito. When I first started, all I used was a needle tool and a trimming tool to carve through the clay. So these bad boys. And it worked, but I didn't get super great results. These aren't super sharp tools, and you don't get great lines with them. You get fine lines, but they're not ideal. So when you pull, like those get a little bit crummy on the sides. So even if this was at a good consistency, you'd still get those kind of weird lines. What I've started using more recently is tools like these. So I have a loop tool like this. I would use this in replacement to this. I get a finer line and it's thinner metal, so it gives me a sharper line. So I like this a lot more than I like this. We've got a bunch of these up in the front, so you guys can use these whenever. And then rather than using a needle tool, what I found with my needle tool is because the tip is so fine, what ends up happening is as you cut in to the clay, it kind of opens like this and then closes itself back up. And you get these really gross looking lines up at the top. So it looks like it's gonna start a good line, but then it closes back up. What I've been using instead is these ball stylus tools. So it looks like a needle tool, but it's got a little tiny ball right on the top of it. And the nice thing about that is that rather than opening the line and then closing it back up, because it's a ball, it opens up the line and keeps it a little valley like this. So I was to go for really fine lines, I would take that ball stylus, and then I can just draw with these. So like I do a lot of trees on my stuff. I just imagine that I'm drawing. So when I'm doing this, I'm just drawing a little tree out. And this is a little bit on the wet side, but that's okay. So I'm just drawing a little tree, using that kind of ball stylus side. You can also use a ballpoint pen. That works really well. But we can see I've got that little tree going there. And that was just with the ball stylus. So it's just like you're drawing. With these little burrs that I have, rather than smudging it with a finger, I take a stiff brush, like this, and then over water, I just slowly kind of work those burrs off. And we can see it gets all those little tiny burrs off. If you go with a finger, it'll smudge it. And you want to do it over water so that you're not kicking up all those dry bits of clay into the air. So either over a bucket of water or over a sink, something like that. You just want to get those burrs out of there. So that's Sgraffito. It's carving into the clay, whereas inlay is carving and then adding slip on top. This technique right here is resist layers. So adding, I use bits of paper, but you could use bits of plastic. You can use leaves, anything like that to get different layers of clay. So what I've got here is some tiny little paper cutouts that I cut in the leaves. And then like a temporary tattoo, I'm gonna take a damp sponge and just squish these on. And what that's gonna do is it's gonna seal the paper to the clay so you get a clean line when you take it off. If you don't do this, that slip is gonna get in between the paper and the clay, and it's not gonna give you a clean line. So I'm just slowly kind of working this down, letting that water soak into the paper, get a really clean seal, and then I'll take my slip and work over the top of that. Just painting that slip on.
So you're painting away from the edge of the paper.
Yes, I don't want to go into the paper at all. So like I've got an edge of paper right there. I don't want to come into that. If I come into that, then I can break that seal a little bit and get slip underneath. So I'm trying to start on the paper and work my way away from the paper. So I'm going over that seam rather than into the seam. Good question, Anne. Just paint those on. Let it dry for a minute. And then I go with my needle and I try and just pick up a little bit of paper. And then I can peel those off and I get a really clean line. The cool thing about this is you can layer it a ton. So you can do a bunch of different layers. So if I wanted to, I could go in with some smaller ones, or I guess I would go in with bigger ones, go over the black, and then do another layer. So I'd have a layer of white, kind of an outline of black, and then another color on top, kind of like this one here. So for this one, what I had done was put a layer of blue on the whole thing, and then took a couple cuts of paper, laid them out in this little flower arrangement, and then took this robin's egg blue slip and brushed it on top of that, pulled off the bits of paper, and then just that blue stayed down below, and the robin's egg was on top, and then I did Sgraffito on top of that. So the cool thing is you can join these techniques together to get some really cool ideas. What I could do, next is then go in with like the mango. So say this wasn't fire, go with the mango, and then I could paint little highlights on these leaves to get even more texture and even more color. And the last thing I want to show, which is a less functional thing, so if you were to do this on a cup or a bowl, I wouldn't do this, but adding slip to bone dry pieces. So this one right here, it's kind of hard to see because there's a lot going on this piece, but if you want to come up and look at it later, I added a bunch of white slip onto a black pot. And what that white slip does is when it's bone dry, because it wants to shrink more, it's going to start to crack off. So on this one, this is a completely bone dry piece. I'm going to take some black slip and kind of cake it on here. And then as it starts to dry, it's going to start to crack off. So it can look really cool. I wouldn't do it for a functional piece, like a piece that you're going to handle quite a bit, because over time, that slip can start to break off. But if it's for a vase or something that's not going to get messed with as often, this is fine. You can just get some cool texture going that way. So then as it starts to dry out, it takes a little while, but you'll start getting little cracks on the surface. I guess you can see a little one starting right there. But because that slip is starting to dry a ton, it's shrinking, but that pot is staying the same size, you're gonna get cracks on the surface. So you can see little cracks starting. I'll let you guys come up and look at this if you want to. But it's a cool way to just add some texture if you're looking for like a kind of rustic, broken down, cool thing. This can be a really cool way. You can start to see those cracks are getting bigger up in that area. So slip is cool. It's a fun way to start adding texture. We'll talk about underglaze next week. It's very similar to slip. There's just a couple things that change. But if you guys want to play around with any of these techniques, they're really fun. There's also great examples of all the slip techniques up here. So right here, and there's a little write-up about it. And then this is the Sumi brushstrokes with slip. That's just painting with slip. So it's this one right here. So they all have a little tile, like these stencils, and they have a write-up about how to do it. So if you ever forget, or if you're like, do I want to do this now, or do I want to sponge it off later, you can read those and it'll give you a good kind of rundown about when to do it. And then this is that combing right here. That's this technique. So lots of things to play with. I have an extra tile right here if anyone wants to play with those, or if there's any extra room on any of these tiles, you guys can play around with it. Or if you have those little test tiles that you guys made the first week, you can play around with those as well. You just want to make sure that slip is going on at leather hard. All right, questions about anything I just talked about? There's lots to play with. Only play with what you're excited about. If you're excited about all of it, then play with all of it. But it's just fun things to play around with and start getting some detail on our pots. Yeah. Cool. All right, let's get after it. So if you guys want to make pots today, you can. If you guys want to play with slip, you can. If you're excited about any projects, like if you did any carving last week that you were stoked about and you want to make a project for that, you can. This is when we kind of start to just find our own path. So now I'm going to start giving you a bunch of techniques. Take in what you want, make what you want. It's all just about making stuff and playing with surface now. Cool.